Hello, good evening. You're very welcome to this evening's webinar. As you can see, it is the Training and Education webinar for Return to Rugby Guidelines for Clubs. Ross O'Donoghue is my name. I'm the Rugby Development Campaigns Officer with the IRFU. This webinar was designed with you very much the volunteer in mind. It's about giving COVID-19 safety officers the chance to hear from the experts as you prepare to put all those plans in place that will reopen our rugby clubs and give us and our communities the health and well-being opportunities that basically we've been craving since March the 12th. This webinar, it'll answer your questions, it will offer some solutions, and in many cases it will put your minds at ease. The first thing I'd like to do is to read a short welcome from President of the IRFU, Nicky Cummin. I wish to commend you in undertaking such an important role in our return to rugby. In unprecedented times, your work provides hope to everyone in the community that better days lie ahead. My hope is that you will be able to look back in years to come and reflect on the positive impact that you have made. The IRFU and your province are here to support you on this shared journey of a return to rugby. And that is sincerely from Nicholas Cummin, the President of the IRFU. Next, for an update on where Irish Rugby stands in terms of the domestic game, we can hand over to IRFU Rugby Development Director, Colin Mackin. Colin.
Hi Ross, good evening everyone. It's great to see so many of you joining us this evening. I think 12 weeks ago, we'd never thought we'd be in this situation. And I think for the last 10 weeks, we were just hearing from everything of what we couldn't do. And you can't do this and you can't do that. So for the last 2 weeks with the project team, we've embarked on the journey of a roadmap to return to rugby. And one of the critical aspects when we started on the journey was to provide insurance for our members, reassurance that they are entering a safe environment. And the call to action last week, I know it took a lot of clubs by surprise, but in fact we're probably ahead of a lot of other sports in doing that, and trying to get the activation in early. Because before any resumption of play, it's absolutely critical that we get the planning right. And I suppose tonight is to give you guys a reassurance as well that you know, when you see all the information going at you, it can be quite daunting. But a lot of that information is a library. It's a library of information that you can go back and reflect on, or critical aspects there that you can reference to guide you and to help you and support you. Not only that, we've undertaken a training and educational platform with all our staff, all our development officers within the provinces, and be reassured that the clubs aren't alone on this. So everyone that's involved in the game will be wrapping around the clubs to support them through this phase. And we want to ensure that and provide that hope that through this phase, through the next phases, that we give hope to our participants that we get rugby back up and open again. And this is a critical part of that journey. And as I say, we're here to support and to help, because we're going into a new normal, and I think we've noticed that in our everyday lives. Rugby won't be any different, and we just want to make sure that the professionalism that the rugby is held within the clubs and within the provinces is maintained, and maybe to a better and a leading light in relation to all sports. And I think the call to arms of everyone here just really highlights that. And from the IRFU, I think we're so grateful, because the clubs are the foundation, and they are the foundation of our game. And without the clubs, we wouldn't have the professional game or other entities. So I commend you with standing up for this role, but I also want to reassure you that there's a lot of common sense to it, and moreover than that, there will be an awful lot of support given to you by us within the union and our provinces. So I think you're going to enjoy this evening. I think you're going to get a really good insight from the project team. You're going to get some legal insight. We have our IRFU director, Rod McLaughlin, with us, and we have Eamon O'Boyle from EOAB Consultants, and he's done a fair bit of work with the state as well in around health and safety. So I do believe you'll get an awful lot out of this, and so I'd like to hand you back over to Ross.
Yeah, Collie, thanks very much. We have had so many questions submitted in advance, and we will be threading them throughout this webinar. A couple of quick ones for you, if that's all right.
No problem.
There's one in here from St Mary's College. When the club have all their requirements met, what happens next?
I think when all the requirements are met and the clubs have a safety plan and they have the various compliance officers, which could be their managers with each club, they can partake and under the phases and the guidelines that we will communicate with in every phase. So for this phase, it'll be individual activities, Ross. So the likes of physical activities, fitness, and closed skills. So up to 15 people with 2 coaches. So yeah, clubs can activate once they've done the planning.
Great. So actual rugby on the horizon then. We've had from the likes of Wanderers and Thurles, Young Munster, Balbriggan, Dundalk, questions around resources in terms of securing the likes of hand sanitizer, signage, PPE, stuff like that. I mean, I appreciate it's a fluid situation, but what's the current IRFU thinking there?
Yeah, it's I got wind of some of the concerns coming in, and we are working with our partners. We have partners that provide some medical equipment already to our national teams and stuff, and we're also looking at other partners. So I think we'll have a bit of news in the coming week, Ross, in terms of getting and providing options for our clubs with discounts, and in addition to that, we're also from my point of view just championing what can we do for clubs, and it's something I will be bringing towards the IRFU Rugby Committee as well.
Great, Collie, thank you very much. And we'll hear you again at the end of the webinar for some closing remarks. But by now you will have received the IRFU Return to Rugby guidelines themselves, had a chance to have a look at them and what that process would look like. Just a quick reminder that the most up-to-date guidelines will always be on irishrugby.ie/return to rugby. That just makes sure that you're always looking at the most up-to-date documents in what is an ever-changing environment, let's be fair. We're going to hand over now to a member of the project team that was behind putting these guidelines together. Colin Finnegan joins us to walk us through some of the core elements of the process. Good evening, Colin.
Thanks, Ross. Good evening, folks. So as Ross said, I'm part of the project team. I'm also the Children and Youth Development Manager with Irish Rugby. I suppose we understand the importance of reopening our clubs and allowing people the opportunity to reopen them in a safe and responsible manner when they want to. So again, we're not forcing anything on that. We wanted to create a number of guidelines that will allow people to go and utilize them when the time is right for them. What you'll see here is the summary roadmap at the top as part of our Running Your Club Return to Rugby for Clubs. As you go down through that, and I'm sure everyone has had a chance to look through this at this point, but you'll see there's a lot of information held within. But what we've done is we've tried to break it out so we can actually go and allow people to get the information that they need. So if you're a player, what do you need to do? If you're a coach, what do you need to do? And this also gives us the opportunity that when we're sharing through various multimedia platforms, be that WhatsApp or any other messaging groups, you have the opportunity to send information directly to people that want that information. So you're not giving them a giant overview, you're actually giving them exact pointed specifications depending on what their role is within a club. If we look at, I suppose, the training and education support for clubs, COVID-19's club safety officers will receive the following education and training. And you have a list of things there. We're obviously on the webinar as we speak. But with that, you've also got a dedicated email helpline. So in each province, we have liaised with the provinces to actually go and create a dedicated contact. So you're not waiting a long time to go and get responses to any sort of queries or any information that is needed. That will come on a regular basis to you. You'll have ongoing support at provincial level as well, and always ask the question. In a time of ambiguity, knowledge is power, and getting that little level of clarity will help go a long way to making sure everyone is confident and comfortable returning to their clubs. COVID-19 club compliance officers. Information will be disseminated through you, the COVID-19 club safety officers. So we will have briefing documents that will go to the officers through you. That will be a key part in making sure that we are staying up to date with the relevant information that is coming from the governments. As Ross said, everything is ever changing. We need to ensure that we have the most up-to-date information. If we look at further information on contacts, you'll see a list of contacts there that you can go and get in touch with to answer any queries, and also the latest governmental information. As part of this, we're currently in the planning stage. Should you go and fulfill everything that is your responsibility in the COVID-19 safety planning stage, you can then move to the reduced activity stage. So over the coming days, we will be releasing this infographic. Know, show and go. We're trying to keep it snappy, sharp and make a point. You need to know your role, you need to show up ready, and then you need to go train well, then go home straight away. All of this information again will be shared, and we will be sharing various infographics and information packs online so that you can print out and circulate them in your club, post them up in your club. But this is, I suppose, the first opportunity to have a look at this infographic that we're going to be utilising in the reduced activity stage. This, and I can only emphasise it, can only happen once you have completed your safety planning stage, you have implemented your health and safety plan for your club and made sure that all your members are aware of it.
Yeah, super. We've got a lot of questions in that I think would be good to get the project team to provide some answers on. Some really simple stuff in here as well, but it's good to ask the question. Ross Gray are asking, will there be a certain amount of time that teams will be allowed to train per day or per time? So what's the, will teams be limited in certain ways, and how often and for how long they can train?
Well, in everything we do and as we return, everything will be guided by the governments in the local jurisdiction. But clubs, I suppose, their main restrictions will be on their amount of pitches and what sort of facility they have in regards pitches. Everything must be adhered to, so your social distancing and all guidelines in place from government and IRFU. So they will be the ones that will dictate how many teams are allowed to train over certain club areas.
Great. Shannon are asking how we deal with the smaller rugby players and specifically around the use of toilets.
Yeah, it's coming to summer camp season, so it's always a question that was going to come up. Clubs are able to utilise the toilet facilities once training resumes. It is the one part of clubhouses that will reopen. And we'd be encouraging clubs to make sure that they're sharing the best practice information to parents regarding use of these facilities.
Okay. Wanderers want to know, they would intend having a shared responsibility for the COVID-19 club safety officer. Is that okay?
Yes.
Great. Ballinasloe, Virginia and Ards are saying that there's a number of guidelines that are asking for forms to be completed. What are the paperless options that can be looked at there?
Currently, we're looking into app possibilities and utilising various non-paper mediums, I would suppose you'd call it. We're far enough down the line on that. We won't be releasing anything this week, but clubs are completely free to go and utilise their own. I suppose other sporting bodies are utilising, be it Microsoft Teams, Google Forms for that as well. And we hope to have some recommendations in the coming weeks as well.
Okay. C.12 are asking, is a compliance officer assigned to a team required to be present at all team training and team events hosted on the club facilities?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, for that specific team.
For that specific team, exactly.
Yeah, and one more here from Dunmanway asking about the COVID-19 club safety officer. Do they have to be present when all activity is on the grounds?
No, a compliance officer must be in situ when an activity is underway, but the COVID-19 club safety officer does not need to be there for every single facet of training or activity.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Colin. I really appreciate your time on that. We've also got many questions coming in pertaining to the law of the land and where clubs sit in terms of insurance and COVID-19. And there is a specific insurance section within the guidelines that you've seen there. But for added clarity, legal counsel for IRFU, Sean Brazel, joins us this evening. He's just going to walk us through some of those big questions. But I think it's fair to say, Sean, that in certain cases, when it comes to insurance and liability, the answers themselves can actually be quite simple.
Absolutely, and I think it is. While it is an important matter, I'm conscious of the fact that the likes of Rod and Eamon O'Boyle there are obviously the experts that the safety officers are really going to want to hear from in this issue. In terms of the two positions, I suppose, primarily the safety officer position and obviously the compliance officer positions that flow from it, from that down through the club. There's obviously a lot of nervousness. We've seen a lot of questions come in around insurance and indemnifications and things like that, and it's understandable. And I suppose the message that we're trying to get across to all the safety officers that are coming on board is that, look, this is the same as other roles in the club, obviously just slightly different with the fact that it's newly created. The one I would compare it to most is probably the child welfare officer, that obviously in the club has a huge amount of responsibilities, and obviously is another role that is well led, I suppose, by the safeguarding policies and things like that we have in place for them. In terms of indemnification, was a question whether the union indemnify the safety officers. That's not really something that we get into, and it's not something that we do traditionally in other roles, and it's not something that we can do in this instance either, unfortunately. It's a system that we're trying to deploy whereby we're giving as much guidance and recommendations and facilitating the role as best as possible, but we're not going to be that police enforcer of it to the nth degree. And I think one of the emails and one of the questions that came through earlier today, I think it was from Old Crescent, was kind of using the legal language around as far as reasonably practical. And the primary kind of cause of action, and it is something, look, we get very nervous in the kind of environment that we're in this country, where everyone gets sued for looking sideways, but the kind of key principles of a cause of action is going to be a negligence cause of action, and whether or not the club can be deemed to have not taken enough reasonable steps to create that safe environment for their members to come back to, and ultimately, hopefully, the guidelines that we have created and the risk assessments and things like that, and the advice that you'll hear from Rod, that takes a lot of pressure off the clubs to have to do that themselves. It's just a case of, I suppose, implementing as opposed to creating themselves. In terms of insurance, we have confirmation from Aon that the club compulsory insurance, when facilities do resume back in due course, that policy of insurance will operate as normal. And I suppose the other thing that might provide a bit of reassurance for the officers is, look, speak to your club secretaries, see and make sure that the public liability policy that you guys have is active and remains unchanged. And there are also, in certain instances, the various club constitutions that clubs actually have, they might actually provide indemnifications themselves to different officers, and might provide a little bit more comfort to the newly appointed safety officers. In terms of it, again, one of the other questions I saw coming through was from the likes of Wexford Wanderers, who were asking about hiring their grounds to other parties, keep fit classes and things like that, or soccer clubs coming in using AstroTurf. What I would say is there's going to be steps throughout this process, and maybe get the teams, get the club back operational before we start worrying about other activities. Where you do start opening, not so much yourself individually to issues, but the club maybe as a whole, is when you start hiring out your facilities to other entities or other bodies, and you then might owe them a duty of care as well as your own members. So that'll be something that we will obviously get to address as we move through the process, and it's not something I'd kind of be worrying about in the immediate future. There was another one then about I think it was from Donna D, yeah. And it was about the various different clubs, I suppose, who might be renting or might not own the properties or the facilities that they're operating out of. And if you're involved with a county council or whatever the relationship might be, there will be some level of interaction between landowner and tenant in that scenario. But again, I would imagine that a lot of the heavy lifting that the project team will have done should satisfy the councils. And again, when you look through a lot of the stuff that we're putting out there, you will see a lot of similarities with other sports, and hopefully there is kind of that comfort in numbers aspect that we're not going to be doing anything radically different to what a county council or whatever might be recommending. So I suppose that the main advice I'd give you is not to really get yourself bogged down in the indemnity side of things, or worried about getting claimed or actions brought against you. If you follow the guidelines, you will be taking all reasonable steps to getting your club into a safe environment, and ultimately that's all that can be expected of anyone. What I'll do is, as I said, Ross, we'll stay on the line in terms of any other questions that might pop up. But I think hearing from Rod and hearing from Eamon, they're the appropriate people that you want to be listening to, and not hearing for a lawyer for the whole duration of the webinar.
That's great, Sean. Really appreciate it.
Not at all.
We'll move on now. All the experts that you've here tonight have been heavily involved in the return to rugby guidelines that have been presented to you, none more so than our IRFU Medical Director, Rod McLaughlin. Rod also sits on the Government of Ireland's expert group on return to sport, and he's here this evening just to talk us through some of the on-pitch matters and what behaviours will see us through to the resumption of rugby. Rod, good evening to you. Thanks for coming back to us.
So what I want to talk to tonight is, and this is a short talk, I've 12 slides, I think. And I actually want to keep it quite high level, because I think sometimes when we see the big long lists and all that you've seen, it can be very daunting. Whereas I think there are a few principles. And if you understand the principles and remember the principles that guide what you're trying to do, then the rest will fall into place. Whereas sometimes if you remember details, you forget principles, and details don't often get you all everywhere. So in terms of what do I want to talk about tonight, I want to talk about, and you'll see it at the start of the beginning, behavior change, because I think what you need to consider is your role is actually trying, in many cases, to change people's behavior. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. I want that we look and we understand why, the why, the how, and the what of what we're doing. And then just from a compliance officer point of view, some on-field considerations, because Eamon will talk more about the facilities end of things. So let's look firstly about change of behavior. And in terms of this, a strategy around COVID being a success, we need three things. We need that there's buy-in from all, that there's a team ethic, and there's social disapproval. So when I talk about buy-in from all, to get buy-in from all, we need that people understand why we're doing something. And this is really key. The why we're doing everything that we're going to talk about tonight is actually to get the game of rugby back, to get the game we love back in the pitch, and to get back to that enjoyment, fun, camaraderie, all the things we associate with rugby. Because it's really important that you understand that the how we do it is by keeping COVID out of the clubs. So it is not about keeping COVID out of the clubs. If COVID wasn't a problem to our game, or didn't make people unwell, we wouldn't care how much it's around. But it's about trying to get the game back, and we need to keep COVID out of the clubs and keep people healthy and safe to get the game back. So that's really important, because that's what will motivate people. What will motivate people is that I'm doing something, and the aim is what I love and enjoy. Whereas when you start talking about viruses, you lose people. In terms then of this team ethic idea, for something like this to be successful, it's important that I understand that what I do for my teammates. So when I maintain good hand hygiene, when I maintain cough etiquette, what I am doing is I'm doing it to protect my teammates, and they will do it to protect me. And the success of this depends on all of us doing it. So trying to create this team ethic around the behavior you're trying to drive. So when you're engaging with people in your club, that they understand, look, guys, this is all about us doing it for one another. And it's only by us doing it for one another we'll be successful. The final thing we need is this thing called social disapproval. And that is that you create this culture that where somebody within the club sees somebody acting inappropriately, for example, not coughing or sneezing into their elbow, not hand sanitizing or washing their hands when appropriate, that there's this culture around that people will point it out to them in a nice way, in a constructive way, and that you would expect the same to happen to you if you fail to do it. And these three things are things that will drive and help maintain a more successful approach to this. So the what? So what do we do to ensure that we keep COVID out of the club? And again, it's trying to keep things simple. It's broadly three things. We do our best to ensure that only the well-attended events and training sessions. When we're there, we do good hand hygiene and cough etiquette, and we, as far as we can, maintain social distancing. It's as simple as that, guys. And if you remember that those are the principles that drive everything you do, you'll see that a lot of what we talk about is just operationalizing that in various situations. I think the other thing to remember is the understanding of how the virus is spread. And in a broad sense, it's in two ways. It's droplet spread, that you get close contact with somebody who coughs or sneezes, or contact with an infected surface. Just to say something about this idea of close contact. So, the HSE, the Health Authority here, and the World Health Authority talk about close contact being within either 2 meters or 1 meter, depending on where you are in the world, of somebody for more than 15 minutes. You need to be clear that this is on the basis that we initially assume that the two people are well. Because no one is suggesting that if you stay within close to somebody who coughs and sneezes all over you for 14 minutes and they're known to have the virus, that you're safe. So you need to understand that. That is on the basis that I assume everyone there is well. So that's different. You don't need 15 minutes to get the virus off somebody who's infected. In terms then of, I suppose the other thing to say here is that out of everything comes an opportunity. So across our high performance team, we have been for a long time driving the effectiveness of hand hygiene in managing infectious diseases. And this is something that Olympic athletes in my previous life were way ahead of rugby in. And when you think about it, good hand hygiene reduces in studies respiratory illness by up to a half and gastrointestinal illness by nearly 40%. And if you think about this year, so we have flu most years, but we've had mumps as an issue within the clubs before COVID ever got us. So what you need to remember is that some of the strategies that we're driving now are things that should be maintained and are good practice long after, hopefully, COVID goes away. The other thing to remember is this idea of, here's a picture. Now, this person has been given something to cough and it looks worse than a cough or a sneeze is. But the idea is that you see that this person in this picture is spreading droplets up to 3 meters away. And if you talk about aerosols, it can be further. So if we look at this idea of what we're doing, all the time what we're trying to do is mitigate risk, is lower the chance of me getting any infectious illness, and obviously in this setting, COVID, from somebody who coughs or sneezes. So if I am 2 meters away from you, then only about 10% of those droplets will hit me. If I'm 1 meter away, 30% of them will hit me. So it's where you manage to set your bar in terms of risk management. And in Ireland at the moment, it is 2 meters. So just remember that. What we're doing is minimizing risk as best we can. Okay, in terms then of the risk mitigation and looking a little bit at how this will become sort of appropriate in terms of, and I'm going to sort of just have 2 slides now here in the field setting. So we've talked about it already, that you would only have well people turning up to training. So this idea of, people checking before they go, are they well, or is there any risk or concern that they may have been in contact with somebody who had potentially COVID? That we don't ask and put pressure on people who are in the HSE risk groups, be they because of their age or other illnesses, under pressure to be attending. The other thing is, and this was touched on, I think, in one of the other questions, the limitation of the number and the duration of the sessions. Now, clearly, the numbers you limit it to depend on the size of the space you've available. So, and let's be clear, outdoor activities are much safer than indoor activities. I've heard one figure of that the risk is 19 times greater is indoors than outdoors in terms of virus transmission. So outdoors is a much safer activity. But the number of people that can be in a session depends on how much space and where you've got to put them. So at the moment, the guidance the weekend that was released was that you could have groups of up to 15. You could have up to 15. Now that includes 2 coaching people. That guidance was also on the basis that this is in a controlled environment with oversight. So it was purposely including 2 people that would be there to oversee that appropriate social distancing and things happen. We're not suggesting that you can have lots of groups of 15 running around your pitch uncontrolled. And then the duration of sessions, guidance hasn't been given on this, and this may be something we consider in the group, in the expert group. But clearly, the longer you're out, the greater the risk. So, certainly, I would think you would want to be considering why would a session be longer than 45 minutes, an hour. Now, camps are slightly different, and more guidance will come around those in later weeks. But if we're talking about a training session, because we're talking about a session where you turn up to train and have your activity and go home, and you turn up ready to train in your kit mat. Again, it's the good hand hygiene and cough etiquette. So that means that entering the pitch, the last thing you might do before you enter the pitch, and therefore you have a hand sanitizing station, is sanitize your hands. Cleaning equipment. Now, again, in this phase, so in the phase we're talking about now, there is no equipment allowed. So you're not allowed share equipment. And if some of you come back at me and say, well, hold on, tennis is allowed back. Singles tennis is allowed back on the basis that people turn up with a set of balls with their own name on it, and they only ever use that. So if I am in a rally with somebody else, I will serve my ball, and if the rally happens to break down on the far side of the net, that person will pick the ball up between their foot and their racket, never touching it, and hitting back to me. And then when they serve with their own tennis ball. So at the moment, there's no sharing of equipment. That is something that obviously will come in later phases and maybe the next phase. And the other thing we must do in terms of risk mitigation is give people the opportunity to carry out what we talk about. So there's no point in telling me sanitize my hands and there's nowhere to do it and no facility to do it. Again, talking a little bit and staying a little bit on the pitch, and I say this in terms of the compliance officers who will be monitoring things potentially on a pitch and that things happen on a pitch. In an ideal world, we'd have little or no contact, but the safest contacts are non-face-to-face fleeting. So in that setting, you should be then clearly aware that things like one-on-one wrestling is not an appropriate contact at this stage, or probably even in the next stage of return, in that it is close contact, direct face-to-face, and probably of a significant duration. And over time, the types of the contact will progress in the nature of them, the duration of them, the nature of them. So it might then move to contacts with pads and the increase in the number that are involved in the contact area. I'm giving you ideas of how you might progress things. Clearly, all this doesn't happen. I'm not suggesting these happen in this stage, but this is the gradual progression through things. I put here no handshakes, high fives, or huddles, or things like that. What I've said all the time is we're trying to change behavior. So remember, all your people are used to doing this automatically at times. So just accept that it may happen, but you need to educate people that you don't want it to happen and then point it out when it does happen. But this is such a routine part of it. When I was talking in another meeting, I don't know if any of you saw, in the Bundesliga, there was actually a head coach who ran down the whole of the dugout, hugging everyone, and he was the only one not wearing a mask. So interesting. But, you know, just these are the things you need to keep an eye out for. And then we're minimizing the shared equipment. In the non-contact area, just consider for the moment, and this will obviously change, minimize use of whistles. Whistles are forcefully blowing air out a hole. And then this idea that when you're running, so if I'm running beside somebody, they should be 2 meters away from me. If there are people in my slipstream and behind me, you really would ideally like that they're about 10 meters away. So these are the things you need to consider that you're overseeing when you're overseeing these sessions. I'm going to just come now to finish on this, back to this change in behavior, because, and I know I'm sort of focusing on it a bit, but it is what we're trying to do. And there are 3 things we need to change anyone's behavior. The first thing is we need to motivate them. And that's why I mentioned this idea of the why we're doing it is about the game and the sport and getting the sport back. The other thing we need to do is we need to give them the capability to do it. So people need to know how to wash their hands, how to use hand sanitizer. And the third thing they need then is the opportunity. So this is the part that we need to educate people as to what to do, and then we need to give them the opportunity. Hence, we talk about hand sanitization stations and things like that at appropriate places. I need to know how to cough and sneeze properly. So it's really important that you remember they're the three things when you're trying to do your role you should be thinking of. How am I trying to get these people to buy into this? How am I trying to get this team out to get? Have I told them how to do it? And then have I given them the opportunity to do that? The other thing is around messaging. When we give messages, it's important that messages have broadly three things associated with them. And the first thing is that it's specific to the user. So remember, you will be trying to influence and change the behavior of a very diverse group, from a player to a coach to maybe other people on administrative roles. So this will be different messages for different groups. And if I take the similarity with concussion, when we rolled out concussion, we had different messages for coaches versus referees, because referees had to manage the pitch situation and a coach had to manage it off the pitch. The other thing a message should be, ideally, is appropriate to a specific situation. So when you're giving a message, so if I giving the referee the message we felt that was most important to them to know was how to get somebody off the pitch. So it's the same here. If you're telling me about hand sanitizing, so what you might be then saying is I'm giving a specific message, and what I'm saying to people is, at the time you enter the pitch, remember to sanitize your hands. And you're giving that message at that time, okay? The other thing about messages is they should have an impact on behavior. So you see, I've given a message in which I'm asking them to do something. If you're giving messages all the time that's just imparting knowledge for knowledge's sake, it has less of an effect on changing behavior. So in summary, in terms of the messages you might give, consider them to be specific to the user that you're giving them to. Try and link them around specific events or times. And that what you're doing is the message involves an impact on behavior. And that's me. I'm happy to take any questions.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Ross.
Rod, thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, but we do have time for one or two rapid fire questions, if that's all right. One question that keeps coming in, Ross Cray, Ballinasloe, Ards have all said it, is where thermometers and temperature checks fit in all of this?
Okay, so at the moment, the government is not guiding that we need to take temperatures. So in reality, they don't come in at this moment in time. Okay. We are not asking people to take temperatures on entering the grounds.
Ashburn are asking what the IRFU position on social distancing is in terms of 1 metre or 2 metres.
Every nation will follow its own government guidelines, so we're at 2 metres. I see a second part of that question about, will it put our teams at a disadvantage at international level? No is the short answer. I don't see how it would, in terms of if you can't contact, whether you stay 1 metre or 2 metres away from somebody, it has the same effect effectively in performance. But the short answer to that question is we will be following the guidelines of our government, which is 2 metres.
Great. For club members who would suffer from a pre-existing condition that may involve, say, a seasonal cough, that Ballinasloe are wondering, do they need to have written permission, or is there some kind of declaration involved, or does it even get to that point?
I think this is where you're actually beginning to manage the other people around. So I think if I were to turn up at a club in the present environment and be coughing all over, be coughing around the place, even with good etiquette, and trying to tell somebody I'm well and I don't have COVID, that might be a challenge. So I'm afraid it may be something that, yes, they may need. It may be that for the peace of mind of all the other people that person would have to interact with, that we may be, I won't say we'll be looking for a declaration. That club may find locally that that's the easiest way to answer it.
Okay. And just a last question. Clondalkin are asking about a proposed solution for ball hygiene. And there is a simple question in there around whether or not we can pass a rugby ball to each other as part of our reduced activities phase. Okay,
so at the moment we can't. So in this phase we can't. That is something that, again, okay, if you look at the risk groups here, and if you look at where we are, and I'm now sort of focusing a little bit briefly on summer camps. The low risk group, clearly in terms of getting problems from COVID, are children, people under sort of 20, and the evidence appears to be that they are also a low risk in terms of as a means of spreading it, unlike other things. You know, children go to school and bring all the viruses home. That doesn't appear to be the same with COVID. So what I'm saying is I say that because we may have children back playing certain levels of activity that our adult counterparts won't over the summer, for example. You know, that is the way it's looking like, potentially. Now, back to then. So at the moment, there is no obviously ball in play, and therefore no ball hygiene issue. When we get to that situation, it'll have to be discussed. But the sort of considerations would be that every player would sanitize their hands immediately before they go on the pitch, and that you sanitize the ball before they go on the pitch. And then in theory, you have a group that are sanitized, that you would then also have things like this phased introduction. You would manage the size of the group. So maybe you have 4 or 5 sharing the one ball together, and another 4 or 5, and over time amalgamating groups. But I suppose the short answer to that is that some of the practicalities of that need to be ironed out as we unroll the phases.
Great. Rod, that's absolutely super. Thank you so much for your time on that, and for taking the time to answer the questions as well. I really appreciate that. You do mention the phases. Before we move on to the next section, it's just worth pointing out that the clarity that we've been speaking about this evening in terms of phases in the return to sport expert group applies only to clubs governed by the Government of Ireland. We are, along with our friends in Ulster Rugby, working with Sport NI and we await clarity there in terms of what that next step 2 might look like in terms of the Northern Ireland Executive's coronavirus recovery plan, but we are across that as well. We'll move on now to our final presenter of the evening. And as you know, the creation of the COVID-19 health and safety plan, and indeed the risk assessment, well, it's critical in the process. It's the big ask in what we're looking at here. And Eamon O'Boyle and Associates, they are health and safety experts. They've been across this. They're also trusted government advisors. And Eamon O'Boyle joins us this evening. We're going to look at the process of planning when it comes to COVID-19. Eamon O'Boyle, good evening, sir.
Essentially, what we're going to be talking about this evening is the best practice in relation to safety planning, and that for rugby clubs, and preparing the club safety plan. Also looking at the whole thing of the club risk assessments. If you go to the next slide there, Dave. The club risk assessments, and also some key messages, and deal with some questions on that afterwards, if that's okay. So if that's that's kind of our agenda for this evening. I suppose underlying the next slide there, Dave. Underlying all of the best practice objectives in with health and safety, I suppose we'd have 3 key objectives. One is to provide a safe environment for all stakeholders, and I think everything that Rod has been saying up to now, and that is completely focused on that. To also ensure an enjoyable experience for people when they're attending at their rugby club, or their training, or their games, or whatever. So it's important that the enjoyability isn't lost through the introduction of measures that are being used for COVID-19. And also, I suppose the other objective is to limit and reduce the likelihood or the spread of the virus. And again, that dovetails in pretty well with the points that Rod was making earlier on. Just in relation to the next slide there, just in relation to the kind of general health and safety, the COVID-19 plans, really they should complement the existing plans that you have within the club. And really what I would suggest there, that within each club there are safety plans for which COVID is another hazard, albeit a different hazard than the typical type of health and safety plans or health and safety risks that we look at, like slipping and tripping and things like that, simply because there's a virus here that we can't see. So we have to do a lot of things to limit the impact of it, and to reduce it. So really our aim is to reduce any risk of infection within the clubs to a tolerable or an acceptable level. And a lot of the time you hear commentary going on at the moment in respect of COVID, and people talking about risk, and whether that we have to eliminate risk. Risk is not something that we eliminate. Risk is something that we bring to a level which is either tolerable or acceptable. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. The government generally requires risk assessments, and indeed the whole risk assessment methodology is something that underpins safety planning in whatever field of endeavour. I'm sure any of you in your workplace, you've come across safety statements, and the whole idea of risk assessments within them is something that will have to be there, and it'll have to be there really prior to reopening. And we have a period of time at the moment when we can engage in this kind of planning quite easily. Just in relation to the kind of health and safety management of risk and the risk management itself, I suppose there are a number of phases in relation to this, and that at the moment we're in the planning stage where we can look at all the risks and we can bring in mitigations for that. We can prepare the venue facilities and that can be things like car parks where people are being dropped off, where people are registering, that there's facilities for social distancing within that. And there's also facilities for the there's also facilities during this period for the training and briefing of club members and that. And I know that in very recent times people have been nominated for jobs specific to COVID, and I know there's a very steep learning curve and there's a lot of information that people have to try and absorb. But this is the opportunity and the time to get that. During training, I mean, the critical things at the moment is the maintenance of social distancing, and we have been talking a little bit there about, what is that distance? That's something that probably will change. At the moment, it's 2 meters, and there's little enough point talking about anything else. That's what it is. The whole idea of sanitation and infection prevention, how we're going to do that, the limitation of numbers, and also the limitation of the activities that you can undertake while training. There was some mention earlier on there in relation to the use of rugby balls or the use of other gym equipment and stuff like that. That's going to be limited. At the start. But I suppose also a feature of this whole COVID thing is the necessity for the maintenance of logs, action lists, contact logs, because one of the features that is critical to this as a safety feature is the necessity to be able to trace very quickly. So we need to know who has been there, the different people that were there. We need to know that for surfaces and that there's cleanliness, hygiene, that all those are recorded, that people are sure that things happened, people are sure who was there, so that if there is, if we have to go back and find out who was there, that we can do it, and that we have checklists to be able to reinforce that. Just the next slide there, Dave. The safety plan and that, I suppose, really needs to be completed by each club prior to recommencing activities. And I think in the documents that went out there, you'll see we put in there's a document there which is really boxes and that you can fill out, which are assistance to preparing the safety plan for the club. Particularly the whole thing of the responsibilities and the roles of safety officers and compliance officers, particularly in respect of COVID-19, that's set out within them, and it's very important that people read them, that they're comfortable, and that they have a clear understanding of exactly what they're supposed to be doing in that regard. Particularly also the conduct of the risk assessment. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And the criteria for resumption, in other words, the control measures and that can be in place, and also that you have within your club kind of actions for a suspected or a confirmed case, how you're going to deal with that. And there is also kind of template documents that have been provided within the documents that hopefully will help you to complete the safety plan. And there's guidance documents that are developed as well with additional information. I think there's a large number of appendices and that you can get information. I suppose when we look at the jobs and that and what people have to do on the next slide there, we have the next plan. Yeah, the safety officer, and that the requirement is to prepare the health and safety plan with the COVID specific issues addressed within it, ensure that the guidelines are followed, ensure that the club is fully prepared for the recommencing of training, and to monitor and support the compliance officers. So effectively, the safety officer's job is really to make sure that all of the necessary facilities, requirements, various things, that they're available, and that the compliance officers then, who monitor it on a training session by training session basis or a day-to-day basis, are supported, and that they have the equipment for doing it, and whatever else they need, or whatever materials. The compliance officers, really, the numbers, we've been asked that, how many do we need? Really, it's proportionate to the size of the club and the number of sessions that they're taking. It's likely that they're coaches, that they'll be the coaches or team managers. It's to ensure that they have that personal assessment declarations are completed and returned and provided to the safety officer beforehand. And this goes back to reinforce the point I was making earlier on there in respect of that we have records, and records are there. The completion of checklists before and after training, and details of those checklists are within those documents as well, that you will see. Advise where instances of non-compliance with social distancing, respiratory etiquette and hygiene rules are observed. In other words, it's the point I suppose Rod was making. It's calling out things that are happening, and again, the reporting of or responding to suspect cases, and that's dealt with within the document, and that. If we go to the next slide, we're dealing with risk assessment. And I suppose a lot of people are probably familiar, or maybe not, with the whole process of our methodology associated with risk assessment. But essentially, it's a simple enough process. It's something we all do every day, except we don't write it down or look at it in a structured way. But it's look at the areas, look at the various activities, like the drop-off areas, the pitches, the clubhouses, the toilets and things. So look at the various areas of activity. Identify kind of infection transmission or where that can happen, and that's greetings, the handshaking, the inability for social distancing, the crossover of training sessions and things like that. Identify who is at risk. Is it coaches, players, parents? And again, we talk about the whole concept of severity and likelihood, which is really the combination of those two is what we calculate a risk value for a particular hazard that we observe. Again, keeping the maintenance of a record to show that you thought about it, that you had actually introduced measures to offset it, and what we call the control measures, and that we implement those control measures. In other words, the provision of the hand sanitizers, to reschedule changing times, to change access paths, to have one way in, one way out, to minimize the crossover and that for people. The next slide just shows a matrix that is normally used for risk assessment, and you can see there how we have severity across the top and likelihood down on the left hand side. So we can see something there that's going to cause extreme harm, and that's almost certain to happen. It's up in the top left hand corner there, being 25, and that will be in the area we would call an unacceptable risk. And our whole objective is to reduce that down into the orange or the green zones. And the typical kind of methods that we would use to control is the sanitization and cleaning, the maintenance of social distance, limiting contact, monitoring, the use of personal protective equipment. So all of those are controlled, and there can be other control measures as well that are suitable in the local context that we're looking at. Again, we end up, once we have done all that, and it's to get away from the whole idea that we can get at a point of zero risk. We have risk really in three categories. It's unacceptable, it's tolerable, or it's acceptable. And we don't get to zero. So we're always trying to shift. When you look at that matrix there on the top right hand corner of the slide, we're always trying to shift down into the green area. In other words, something that is very rare and that does negligible harm. You can see in the bottom right hand corner, which is something that we would always be trying to achieve. The next slide just shows how we present and collect that. We can see just a subject area there in relation to physical distance, the hazards and the effects, the different people to whom it impacts on. Again, the severity and the likelihood, and that ends up at 4x4, which is a 16. It's red. So then we have a whole list of various controls that we put in place, and that then reduces the severity of getting COVID, stays the same, but the likelihood of it happening is very much reduced. So it brings it down into the yellow zone. And there's templates for all of these within the documents. I suppose there are some key messages, which is the next slide, which are really important for individuals. And it's important that we all recognise that we all have a role and that we need to lead by our own example, by practicing the social distancing, by practicing the personal hygiene and the hand sanitation. We have a role to read and be familiar with the documents that have been published for the IRFU and for clubs, and I suppose it's very important that we use the opportunity to support the clubs throughout all of this process. I suppose the key things for the clubs is, that somebody who is discharging these roles of safety officer and compliance officer, that they're the right people for the job and that they're comfortable in doing it. It requires a lot of planning to plan out before you recommence the training. The maintenance of records is crucial. And there is a facility that we've spoken about between the branches and the IRFU itself for providing assistance, where we're available if there's clarity or anything that is required for any of these things or any of these issues that may arise. The last slide is one that just probably reinforces, and it's part of what the IRFU have, is staying at home if you feel sick. Wash your hands, cover your mouth or sneezing, and keep social distance. And these messages are being repeated ad nauseum. And I suspect with Rod's approval, they're going to keep getting approved. They're going to keep getting put out there again and again, because that's the best defence that we have. Sorry, I'm conscious of the time there, but
that's great,
that's me, Ross.
Yeah, we might just try a couple of quick questions if we can. I know Galway Bay are asking a question about running water. We must bear in mind that not all rugby clubs have access to running water. So is there a solution for those clubs that don't have running water at a training ground or facility to wash hands and clean equipment?
Yes, there are. There are some. There are on the market. There are kind of temporary sinks that you can get in, but there's also hand sanitation and stuff like that. Hand sanitizers that can be used, but there is mobile hot water sinks that can be bought. They're about 350, 400 euros to buy.
And an option for people to bring their own bottled water as well.
Exactly. Yes.
And just one more question. In preparation, this is from Ballinasloe. In preparation for training, the health and safety template, there's reference to how a member is asked if they're a vulnerable person. How would this information influence decision making where they're listed as a vulnerable person?
Well, I think the whole thing for vulnerable people, it's the spreading of the virus to your own family members, and that that if you're living with people who are vulnerable, and that you may need to think about. And I suppose the whole purpose of this is that people would remind themselves of their responsibilities in respect of this. So it will be important to know that if I am vulnerable, or if I'm with somebody that's vulnerable, I need to be careful.
We will just go back to Colin McEntee, the IRFU Director of Rugby Development, for some closing remarks on this evening.
Thanks, Ross, and thanks all our presenters this evening. I think I'll try and do a quick synopsis, a very quick one in relation to this evening. I suppose we're on a planning journey, guys, for our return to rugby, and it's just critically about what I capture is how do we play our part to manage the risk and to ensure that our sport is providing a safe environment, and to provide that reassurance, because a lot of people are asking, and members are asking about, that there's a bit of a fear there. And I think this mitigates against that by showing how professional we are in our planning and in our implementation of same. I think the big thing that we all have to work on is the change of behaviour. I think that's critical. And I think, it probably provides more clarity, because it seems to be the common theme that's coming through from Rod and Eamon is about behaviour and behaviour change with real action. And I think that's the big thing in relation to the planning that we can take from it, because some of the other stuff can be really, really overwhelming. But if we get good hygiene etiquette to change behaviour with good practice and following guidelines, I think our clubs are well on the road to returning. I suppose to emphasise again, I think when the safety plans and the plans are in place, I think clubs then at that stage, and when they can implement the plans, they can enter the reduced activity phase. So I think that more or less sums up where we are. I suppose for the clubs, there's on the website as well, you'll find links to the provinces. And if you need to access any information or what officers are around for your local area, I think you'll get all that information through the branches, and then the officers will be in touch. There's also a platform that feeds all information or other questions to Rod and to Eamon, that we will absolutely endeavour to answer, and we keep everything online. The other thing I will say, this is such a fluid situation. It's really important that we keep abreast of what's happening, because things change. Last week we weren't planning in relation to how this week would land, and then Friday the government come out. Phase 3 could offer a totally different environment, and phase 4 might be different again. So I think it's really important that we just keep abreast of all the update information, and that we will be updating what the phases look like for rugby all the while. And just to finally to say to you guys that you're absolutely doing a critical job for the returning of rugby, and we can only commend you guys, and that we will absolutely do what we can to support you through this process. And it's something to get really excited about, returning to rugby. It's something that the last 14 weeks or whatever, it's been quite depressing. So I think getting live sport back, and I think it'll really help our communities and our mental health as well. So I bid you all a good evening, and stay well.
That's great, Collie. Thank you so much to all of you. Good night and God bless. Thank you.
Good night.